In August 1948, a wildlife biologist named Elmo W. Heder loaded 76 live beavers into surplus World War II parachute crates, pushed them out of a Beechcraft aircraft over the Chamberlain Basin of central Idaho, and then largely forgot they existed. The state of Idaho called it a practical solution to an impossible logistics problem. The scientific community published one paper, filed it, and moved on. For the next 77 years, almost no one looked back. That was a mistake. Because what those 76 animals did unobserved, unmanaged, and completely undisturbed, after the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness Act sealed off 2.3 million acres from human interference in 1980, is not a footnote in wildlife management history. It is the most significant unintentional rewilding experiment ever conducted on American soil, and the data confirming it has only just arrived. This video is built on 3 sources that do not speculate. The first is Heder's own 1,950 paper in the Journal of Wildlife Management, a methodical, unsentimental account of exactly what he did, how much it cost, and what he expected. The second is NASA Earth Observatory satellite imagery showing what those same coordinates look like today, a chain of wetland complexes stretching for miles through terrain that, by every ecological model, should be fire-scorched and drought-stressed. The third is a 2025 Stanford University research review that, for the first time, formally quantifies the hydrological value of beaver-engineered watersheds in the American West, and the numbers are not close. The official story has always been straightforward. Idaho Fish and Game had too many beavers in the Treasure Valley and not enough accessible terrain to relocate them by mule. Heder improvised with surplus military gear. The operation worked well enough, and that was that. A quirky bit of post-war ingenuity, worth a paragraph in a wildlife almanac, maybe a segment on a nature program, nothing more. But there is one detail the official story never explains. Why, in 77 years, no wildfire has burned through the core of the Chamberlain Basin the way it has burned through nearly everything around it. That question has an answer. And once you understand it, you will need to reconsider everything you think you know about how the American West actually works and why we are losing it. To understand why those 76 animals were able to do what no government program, no federal infrastructure project, and no billion-dollar water management initiative has managed to replicate, you need to understand what a beaver actually is. Not the cartoon, not the dam-building rodent in a nature documentary, the biological reality. A North American beaver, Castor canadensis, is, by any serious measure, one of the most sophisticated environmental engineers on the planet. Its front teeth are not white. They are orange, almost rust-colored, because the outer enamel is reinforced with iron compounds that make them harder than human teeth and self-sharpening through use. A beaver does not wear its teeth down. It hones them. It can fell a willow 4 inches in diameter in under 3 minutes. And it will not stop until it has used every part of that tree, the bark for food, the branches for construction, the trunk for the foundation of a structure that, in some documented cases, spans more than 100 feet and holds back enough water to permanently alter the hydrology of an entire valley. But the teeth are not even the most remarkable part. A beaver responds, neurologically and compulsively, to the sound of running water, not to the sight of a stream, not to the smell of moisture, to the acoustic signature of water in motion. When researchers played recordings of running water through speakers buried in dry ground, beavers attempted to dam the speakers. The trigger is that precise, and that irresistible. What this means, ecologically, is that a beaver dropped into a watershed does not wait for conditions to improve. It does not assess. It does not plan in any way a human would recognize. It simply begins. And it does not stop. The result is not a dam, it is a system. A beaver colony, given sufficient time, does not merely slow a stream, it reconstructs the relationship between land and water across an entire drainage. It raises the water table. It creates wetland meadows where none existed. It filters sediment, sequesters carbon, and produces the one thing a drought-stressed landscape cannot manufacture on its own: water that stays. Think about that the next time you read about a western state spending $400 million on a water retention project. But here is what makes the 1,948 Idaho operation so consequential, and why understanding these animals is not background, it is the whole point. Before Elmo Header ever loaded a crate onto that beechcraft, America had already come within a generation of losing these animals entirely. And the story of how that happened is the story of why the West is as fragile as it is today. Here is what you need to understand about the American West before European contact. It was wet. Not wet in the way we use that word today. Occasional rain, seasonal rivers, snowpack that retreats by July. Wet in the structural sense. Wet in the way that matters. Across the Great Basin, the Rocky Mountain foothills, the high desert plateaus of what would become Idaho and Wyoming and Oregon, there existed a continental network of slow-moving water, shallow ponds, saturated meadows, and high water tables, maintained not by rainfall alone, but by an estimated 400 million beavers, whose dams, by some hydrological estimates, held back more fresh water than all the reservoirs the United States has constructed in its entire history. Then the Europeans arrived, and within 200 years, they were gone. The North American fur trade, which peaked between roughly 1,600 and 1,840, was not a modest commercial enterprise. It was an industrialized extraction event. Hudson's Bay Company alone processed hundreds of thousands of beaver pelts annually at the height of the trade, and the demand from European hat markets, beaver felt was the premium material of the era. Irreplaceable for waterproof top hats worn by every gentleman on the continent, was effectively unlimited. Trappers did not harvest selectively. They trapped watersheds to functional extinction, moving upstream until there was nothing left, then moving to the next drainage. By 1840, beavers had been eliminated from most of their historic range across the continental United States. The population that had numbered in the hundreds of millions had collapsed, by some estimates, to fewer than 100,000 animals. What followed was not immediately visible. It unfolded over decades. Streams that had been slowed and spread by beaver dams began to cut downward, incising their banks, draining the surrounding water table, converting saturated meadows into dry terraces. Wetlands dried. Springs stopped flowing. The landscape, deprived of the biological infrastructure that had maintained its moisture for thousands of years, began a slow, measurable contraction. Hydrologists now have a name for what happened. They call it stream incision. The official literature frames it as a natural geomorphological process. What it actually was is the visible aftermath of removing 400 million ecosystem engineers from a continent in 2 centuries. If this is reshaping what you thought you knew, hit subscribe. This channel goes deep on exactly these stories, the ones where the official framing and the documented evidence point in opposite directions. Now, back to Idaho, because what Elmo Header was actually trying to fix in 1948 was not a logistics problem. It was the tail end of this catastrophe. By 1948, Idaho Fish and Game was running out of options. The post-war population boom spreading across the Treasure Valley subdivisions, irrigation canals, suburban lots, replacing the riparian habitat that beavers require, had created what wildlife managers called a conflict animal problem. There were too many beavers in the lowlands where people now lived, and not enough beavers in the remote highland drainages where the landscape desperately needed them. The solution, in principle, was straightforward. Relocate them. Move the animals from where they were causing problems to where they could do good. The execution was nearly impossible. The Chamberlain Basin, the target relocation zone, sits in the heart of central Idaho's most rugged terrain, no roads, no trails wide enough for vehicles, and mountain passes that remained snow-locked for most of the year. The standard method was pack mule. Beavers would be trapped, loaded into wooden crates, and transported by mule train over mountain passes that took days to cross. The mortality rate was severe. Beavers are physiologically stress-sensitive animals. The combination of confinement, unfamiliar sounds and smells, extreme temperature swings at altitude, and the physical trauma of multi-day mule transport killed a significant portion of every relocated cohort before they ever reached the release site. Idaho Fish and Game was spending substantial resources to move animals that were dying en route. Elmo Heater, then a wildlife management agent with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, looked at this problem and arrived at a solution that, stated plainly, sounds like a joke: drop them from the sky. But Heater was not improvising carelessly. He was a methodical man, and his 1,950-paper documents a genuinely rigorous engineering process. The problem, as he defined it, was not the fall itself. Beavers are dense, low center of gravity animals, and preliminary testing suggested they could survive an impact from altitude if the deceleration was controlled. The problem was the crate. Standard wooden shipping crates were too heavy, too rigid, and too likely to injure the animal on landing. Header needed something that would open on impact, release the beaver immediately, and then become irrelevant because a beaver standing next to a wooden box in the middle of a wilderness drainage would simply chew it apart anyway. And here was the key innovation. Header designed a crate from surplus World War II, materials lightweight, spring-loaded, with a latch mechanism triggered by the landing impact itself. The moment the crate hit the ground, it opened. The beaver walked out. The parachute, the rigging, the crate, all of it left behind, biodegradable or irrelevant. While the animal did what it was neurologically compelled to do, the instant it heard the sound of the stream below, it began. The elegance of the solution was not the parachute. It was the understanding that once a beaver reached the right location, no further human intervention was required or even useful. Header was not trying to manage an ecosystem. He was trying to deliver the right animal to the right place and then get out of the way. What he did not yet know was that one beaver in particular was about to make the entire case for him. His name was Geronimo. That is not editorial embellishment. That is what Elmo Header called him in the official record, a single beaver, selected from the relocation pool in the summer of 1948, designated as the test subject for the entire aerial drop program. Before Header would commit 75 animals to an untested delivery method, he needed proof, not theory, not engineering calculations on paper. Documented, repeatable, observable proof that a beaver could be dropped from altitude in one of his spring-loaded crates, land without fatal injury, and behave normally upon release. Geronimo gave him that proof, repeatedly. According to Header's own paper, the test beaver was dropped multiple times, loaded back into a crate after each successful landing, transported back to altitude, and dropped again. The precise number of test drops documented in the record is 3, though some wildlife historians have suggested the actual figure was higher. What the paper records unambiguously is this: Geronimo survived every drop. He emerged from the crate each time in good condition, oriented quickly, and displayed no lasting behavioral abnormalities. He was, by every metric Header could measure, uninjured and functional. The final entry concerning Geronimo in Header's paper is one of the more quietly remarkable sentences in wildlife management literature. Having served as the proof of concept for the entire operation, having been dropped from a moving aircraft on multiple occasions and survived each time, Geronimo was loaded into a crate one last time and dropped with the main cohort into the Chamberlain Basin. He was not retired. He was not kept as a control subject. He was given a parachute and sent to work with the rest of them. Let that land for a second. The beaver who proved the method was deployed by the method. His final contribution was not data, it was presence. What Header had demonstrated, through Geronimo, was something more significant than a functioning delivery system. He had demonstrated that the intervention itself could be made nearly invisible, that you could move a wild animal across impossible terrain, introduce it to an unfamiliar watershed, and have it begin ecosystem construction within hours of arrival, with zero ongoing management required. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this video has shown you something you've genuinely never heard before, hit the like button and subscribe. It's the best way to make sure this kind of evidence-based storytelling keeps reaching people who care about it. Now, let's look at what happened next, because what 76 beavers did with 77 years of complete silence is the reason this story matters at all. After August 1948, no one went back. That is not a figure of speech. For the next 3 decades, the Chamberlain Basin beaver population received no follow-up study, no population census, no ecological monitoring of any kind that has survived in the public record. Header published his paper in 1950, documenting the methodology and the immediate results of the drop 76 animals delivered. Survival rate high, operation deemed a success, and then the file closed. Idaho Fish and Game moved on to other problems. The beavers, somewhere in the drainage systems of a roadless mountain wilderness, were on their own. For 32 years, that was simply the condition. Remote terrain, no roads, no mandate to follow up. The beavers worked. The agency had other priorities. And then, in 1980, something happened that transformed an oversight into something far more consequential. President Jimmy Carter signed the Central Idaho Wilderness Act. designating 2.3 million acres of roadless terrain, including the entirety of the Chamberlain Basin, as the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. It was the largest wilderness area in the contiguous United States outside Alaska. The designation was driven by conservation advocates, by Senator Frank Church, and by a political coalition that had spent years fighting timber and mining interests for exactly this outcome. The intent was to protect the landscape from industrial extraction. What the designation also did, entirely by accident, was seal off the 1,948 beaver population from any possibility of human interference permanently and with the force of federal law. No trapping, no management, no culling, no relocation, no research stations, no roads that would allow any of those things. The beavers that descended from the 1,948 cohort were, from 1,980 forward, legally and physically unreachable. What had been an administrative oversight became a protected scientific control group spanning more than 2 million acres. And that is where the story gets truly interesting. Because what the wilderness designation created without anyone designing it, without anyone recognizing it at the time, was the conditions for a long-term ecological experiment that no university could have funded, no ethics board would have approved, and no government agency would have had the patience to run. 45 years of zero human interference, in terrain where beavers had been deliberately seeded, with no exits and no interventions. The question was never whether the beavers had survived. By the time researchers finally looked at the satellite data, that question had already been answered. The question, the one that changes everything, was what they had built while no one was watching. They built a fortress. When researchers began systematically analyzing NASA Earth Observatory satellite imagery of the Chamberlain Basin in the early 2020s, they were not looking for evidence of the 1,948 operation. Most of them did not know the 1,948 operation had occurred. They were looking at fire behavior specifically, trying to understand why certain areas of the central Idaho wilderness emerged from the mega fire seasons of 2021 and 2022, largely intact, while the surrounding terrain burned at catastrophic intensity. The Chamberlain Basin kept appearing in the data as an anomaly, green, wet, and unburned, surrounded on multiple sides by fire-scarred landscape, satellite pass after satellite pass, year after year. What the imagery showed, once researchers began pulling historical comparisons, was not a natural wetland, it was a constructed one. A network of beaver ponds, meadows, and saturated riparian corridors extending across multiple drainages, a system so extensive and so hydrologically active that it had, over 77 years, effectively rewritten the moisture profile of an entire mountain basin. The surface water visible from orbit represents only the most obvious layer. Below it, according to the 2025 Stanford Research Review, beaver-engineered watersheds in the American West maintain water tables that extend laterally up to 10 times the width of the visible pond surface. The water you can see from a satellite is a fraction of the water that exists. This is what researchers now call a refugium, a zone that retains sufficient moisture during extreme fire conditions to resist ignition entirely. Not to slow a fire, not to reduce fire intensity. To not burn at all. The Chamberlain Basin Beaver Complex functioned as a fire break, measured not in feet but in miles. A green island in a burning landscape, maintained by animals operating on pure biological instinct with no human direction whatsoever. The 2021 Brazier Review, a landmark synthesis of beaver rewilding research published in the journal Earth Science Reviews, documented this firebreak effect across multiple Western study sites and concluded that beaver-maintained wetlands represent one of the only passive, self-sustaining fire mitigation systems yet identified in temperate North American ecosystems. Passive, self-sustaining, requiring no maintenance budget, no annual appropriation, no workforce. 3 separate data sources, NASA satellite imagery, the Brazier Review's multi-site analysis, and the 2025 Stanford quantitative assessment. No coordinated agenda between them, all describing the same phenomenon in the same basin. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel doesn't look away from the stories that matter. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to see it, because the next piece of evidence is genuinely more disturbing than anything we've covered so far. Because what the fire data reveals is only the visible consequence. The deeper implication, the one that should concern every policymaker, every water manager, every person living in a drought-declared western county, is what this means about the infrastructure we already had and chose to ignore. Here is what the full evidence shows, assembled in one place. A population of 76 beavers, delivered to a remote Idaho watershed in 1948 for roughly $8 per animal, built a hydrological network so extensive it is visible from orbit. They raised the water table across multiple drainages. They created wetland meadows where none had existed. They stored more water in the subsurface of a single mountain basin than many municipal reservoir systems hold above ground. They maintained that system without wages, without maintenance budgets, without any human input of any kind, for 3/4 of a century. And when the fires came, the catastrophic, record-breaking fires of the 2020s that have killed people, destroyed towns, and cost the federal government tens of billions of dollars in suppression efforts, the Chamberlain Basin did not burn. Not because of a fire management plan, not because of aerial retardant drops or prescribed burns or the deployment of thousands of firefighters along containment lines, because of beavers. The fur trade removed 400 million of them in 200 years. The western landscape dried and incised and became the fuel-laden tinderbox it is today. We built dams and aqueducts and elaborate water infrastructure to compensate for what we had dismantled. We spent billions. The beavers, in 77 years of silence, quietly demonstrated that we had been solving the wrong problem with the wrong tools at the wrong scale. The question is no longer whether beaver rewilding works. The Chamberlain Basin, the Brazier Review, the Stanford data, and the NASA imagery have answered that question with a thoroughness that cannot be disputed. The question, the one that should be keeping water managers and fire ecologists and climate scientists awake at night, is how many more decades we intend to spend funding the expensive, fragile, human-engineered substitutes for a system that nature already knows how to build at no cost, from materials it has been perfecting for 24 million years. We have been fighting the symptoms of a problem we created, with tools more costly and less effective than the ones we destroyed. That is not a hypothesis. It is a documented conclusion. It is measurable from space. There is something in this story that goes beyond hydrology or fire behavior or climate policy, something that touches a harder question about the relationship between human intelligence and natural systems. We have spent the better part of 3 centuries operating on the assumption that our engineering represents an improvement on ecological processes that we do not fully understand. The Chamberlain Basin is a data point against that assumption. A single wildlife agent with surplus parachute materials and a willingness to get out of the way produced, entirely by accident, one of the most resilient climate systems in the American West. The institutions, the agencies, the billion-dollar programs that came after him have not matched it. The next video takes this question to Scotland, where 11 beavers were reintroduced to the River Tay catchment in 2009 and where, in just 15 years, the evidence of watershed transformation is already appearing in the data. What researchers found there adds a dimension to this story that we did not have space to cover here, and it changes the timeline of what restoration actually requires. If this video shifted how you understand what we have lost and what we could recover, share it with someone who needs to see the evidence. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is not a story that ends here. In August 1948, a biologist pushed 76 animals out of an airplane, filed 1 paper, and moved on. 77 years later, the wilderness those animals built is one of the only places in the American West that didn't burn.